The year was 1987. Three nuns walked into the forest behind St. Catherine's Convent for their evening prayers. They never came back. For 37 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling mysteries in rural Vermont. No bodies, no evidence, no answers. Until a construction crew broke ground on what was supposed to be a new community center and unearthed something that would shatter everything the town thought they knew about that October night. This is the story of Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, and Sister Claire. Three women who vanished without a trace, and the dark secret that lay buried beneath holy ground for nearly 4 decades. If you're drawn to stories of unsolved mysteries and the truth that refuses to stay hidden, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Father Benedict Marsh stood at the edge of the excavation site, his weathered hands gripping his wooden cane so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The October morning air carried the same crisp bite it had 37 years ago, on the day they disappeared. He was 43 then, newly assigned to St. Catherine's Parish. Now, at 80, he had returned to witness what he had always feared would eventually surface. The construction foreman approached him slowly, removing his hard hat as he walked. His face was pale, younger than his years suddenly, the way men looked when they stumbled upon death unexpectedly. "Father," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we've stopped all work. The police are on their way." Benedict nodded, his eyes fixed on the muddy pit below. Yellow tarps had been hastily thrown over something, shapes that were unmistakably human in their terrible geometry. 3 of them? After all these years, 3. He closed his eyes and saw their faces as clearly as if they stood before him now. Sister Margaret, with her kind eyes and patient smile, always the first to volunteer for the most difficult tasks. Sister Therese, barely 25, her faith as fierce as it was innocent. And Sister Claire, the eldest, who had secrets in her eyes that Benedict had never quite understood, until now. "Father Marsh," the foreman's voice pulled him back. "Did you know them? The sisters who disappeared?" Benedict opened his eyes, feeling every one of his 80 years settle into his bones. "Yes," he said quietly. "I knew them. I was the last person to see them alive." The foreman shifted uncomfortably. "The police will want to speak with you." "I know." Benedict turned away from the pit, from those terrible shapes beneath the yellow tarps. "I've been waiting 37 years for this conversation." As he walked toward his car, he could feel the weight of what was coming. The questions, the investigation, the resurrection of a past that the entire town had tried so hard to bury, metaphorically speaking, though now it seemed someone had taken that quite literally. He reached his sedan and paused, one hand on the door, looking back at St. Catherine's Convent, rising against the gray October sky. The building had been abandoned for 15 years now, its windows dark and empty, its halls silent. But on that autumn evening in 1987, it had been alive with prayer and purpose, right up until the moment 3 of its inhabitants walked into the forest and vanished from the world. Benedict slid behind the wheel and sat in the silence of his car, waiting for the police sirens he could already hear in the distance. In his coat pocket, his fingers found the worn edge of a photograph he had carried for 37 years. 3 nuns, smiling at the camera, unaware that they had less than a week to live. He had always known this day would come. Secrets, especially the dark ones, especially those steeped in blood and sanctified ground, never stayed buried forever. The sirens grew louder. Detective Sarah Chen pulled her unmarked sedan into the gravel parking lot of what used to be St. Catherine's Convent at 9:30 in the morning. The building loomed before her, a Gothic revival structure that had aged poorly, its gray stone facade streaked with water damage and spotted with moss. She had grown up 20 miles from here, in the town of Millbrook Falls, and had heard the stories about the vanishing nuns her entire life. Every Vermont kid had. It was the kind of local legend that got whispered at sleepovers and around campfires. The mystery that never got solved. The question that never got answered. Now, apparently, it was about to be. She stepped out of the car, pulling her jacket tighter against the October wind. The excavation site was cordoned off with police tape, and she could see at least a dozen people moving around the perimeter. Crime scene techs, uniformed officers, the medical examiner's van, parked at an angle near the pit. Detective Marcus Webb, her partner of 6 years, was already there, standing near the yellow tarps with his notebook out. Sarah ducked under the police tape and made her way across the uneven ground. Marcus looked up as she approached, and she could see the tension in his face. Marcus was normally unflappable, a 20-year veteran who had seen everything from domestic murders to gang violence. But this was different. This was history resurfacing. 3 bodies, he said without preamble, all female, based on preliminary examination, skeletal remains, but with significant preservation due to the soil composition. Dr. Reeves thinks they've been down there between 30 and 40 years. Sarah looked toward the pit. So, it could be them. The missing nuns. Could be. Marcus flipped a page in his notebook. The construction crew broke ground yesterday afternoon. They were digging the foundation for a new community center, something the town council approved 6 months ago. Hit the first remains around 4 p.m. Called it in immediately. Who's the foreman? Guy named Tom Patterson. He's over there. Marcus gestured toward a middle-aged man, sitting on the bumper of a pickup truck, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Pretty shaken up. Says in 30 years of construction working, he's never found anything worse than old bottles and pottery shards. Sarah studied the scene, her investigative mind already cataloging details. The location was about 200 yards behind the main convent building, in what appeared to have once been a garden or cultivated area. Now, it was overgrown with weeds and wild shrubs, the kind of forgotten space that accumulated when a building stood abandoned long enough. "Where's the priest?" she asked. "The one who was here in 1987. Marcus's expression shifted slightly. "Father Benedict Marsh. He's in his car over there. Says he was the last person to see the sisters alive. He's been waiting to give a statement." Sarah turned and spotted an old sedan parked near the tree line. Through the windshield, she could make out the silhouette of an elderly man, sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, suggested he was bracing for impact. "Let's talk to him," Sarah said. They crossed the excavation site and approached the sedan. Sarah tapped lightly on the window, and after a moment, Father Benedict turned his head. His face was deeply lined, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to look through rather than at her. He rolled down the window manually, the old crank groaning with each rotation. "Father Marsh," Sarah showed him her badge. "I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Webb. We'd like to ask you some questions about the evening of October 15th, 1987. Benedict nodded slowly. "I've been expecting this conversation for a very long time, Detective." His voice was steady, but Sarah detected something underneath it. Not quite fear, more like resignation. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Marcus asked. Benedict reached for his cane and carefully extracted himself from the car. He was tall, though age had curved his spine, and he moved with the deliberate caution of someone who knew their body's limitations. Sarah gestured toward a small folding table that had been set up near the command post, and the three of them walked over. Once seated, Sarah pulled out her own notebook. "Father Marsh, can you tell us about the last time you saw Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, and Sister Claire?" Benedict folded his hands on the table, his fingers interlaced. It was a Thursday evening, October 15th, 1987. The sisters maintained a tradition of evening prayer in the forest. There was a small clearing, about a quarter-mile into the woods, where they would go to pray the rosary and practice contemplative silence. They left the convent at 6:30 p.m. All three of them together. Yes, always together. Sister Margaret led the evening prayers. Sister Therese and Sister Claire accompanied her. "And when did you realize they hadn't returned?" Benedict's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dinner was served at 7:30. When they didn't appear, Sister Anne, who was the convent's cook at the time, came to find me. I was in my office, working on Sunday's homily. She was concerned. The sisters were never late for meals. Never." Sarah made notes, watching his face. "What did you do?" "I went to look for them. I took a flashlight and walked the path they always took into the forest. I found the clearing where they prayed. Their rosaries were there, all three of them, laid out on a flat stone they used as a kind of altar. But the sisters were gone." Marcus leaned forward. "Their rosaries were left behind?" "Yes." "That's unusual, isn't it? For nuns to leave their rosaries." Benedict met his eyes. "It's more than unusual, Detective. It's unthinkable. A nun's rosary is perhaps her most precious possession. To leave it behind would be like leaving a piece of her soul." A chill wind swept across the excavation site. Sarah could hear the crime scene techs moving around the pit, the click of cameras, the low murmur of professional voices discussing the dead. She looked at Benedict and saw something in his expression that made her pause. "Father Marsh," she said carefully, "do you know what happened to them?" He was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too soft to hear. "I know what I saw that night, Detective, and I know what I was told to forget, but I've never stopped remembering." The interview room at the Millbrook Falls Police Department was small and institutional, with cinder block walls painted a depressing shade of beige. Sarah sat across from Father Benedict, a digital recorder between them on the scarred table. Marcus stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression neutral but attentive. "Father Marsh," Sarah began, her voice measured, "you said you know what you saw that night. I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how strange it might sound." Benedict's hands rested on the table, steady despite his age. He stared at them for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak words he had kept locked away for 37 years. "After I found the rosaries in the clearing," he said quietly, "I searched the surrounding area. It was getting dark, but I had my flashlight. I called their names. Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, Sister Claire, over and over." He paused. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just this oppressive quiet that felt wrong. Sarah wrote this down. "How long did you search?" "Perhaps 20 minutes. And then I heard something. A sound coming from deeper in the woods, past the clearing. It was singing, hymnal singing. But the words were wrong, distorted." Marcus shifted his weight. "Wrong how?" Benedict's fingers tightened slightly. "The melody was familiar. A traditional Gregorian chant we sang during Vespers, but the words were Latin I didn't recognize. And the voices, they sounded like the sisters, but there were more than 3. Maybe 6 or 7 voices, all layered together." "What did you do?" I moved toward the sound. I shouldn't have. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run back to the convent and call for help. But I had to know if it was them. His voice cracked slightly. I had to try to help them. Sarah could see the memory playing behind his eyes, vivid and terrible, even after all these years. She kept her voice gentle. What did you find? Benedict drew a slow breath. There was another clearing, one I had never seen before. Though I had walked those woods dozens of times, the trees formed a perfect circle, and in the center was a stone structure, not natural, carved. It looked ancient, pre-colonial perhaps, and around it stood 7 figures in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. The room went very quiet. Sarah could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant sound of phones ringing in the bullpen outside. The 3 sisters were there, Benedict continued. Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, and Sister Claire. They were kneeling in front of the stone structure, their heads bowed. The other 4 figures stood behind them, and they were the ones singing that horrible, distorted chant. Could you see the faces of the other 4? Marcus asked. Benedict shook his head. The hoods concealed them, but I remember thinking their proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. The way they moved, it wasn't quite human. Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus. She knew how this would sound in a police report, how it would be received by the district attorney's office. But she also knew that trauma could distort memory, that fear could transform ordinary details into something nightmarish. What happened next, Father? I must have made a sound, stepped on a branch perhaps, because all 7 figures turned toward me at once. And the sisters, when they looked at me, their eyes were wrong, empty, like they were looking through me at something else entirely. He closed his eyes. I ran. God forgive me, I ran. I crashed through the forest back to the convent, and I locked myself in my office. I called the police, told them the sisters were missing, but I didn't tell them about the clearing or the figures, or what I had seen. Why not? Benedict opened his eyes. Because within an hour of my call, Bishop Carruthers arrived from Burlington. He came to my office, and he sat exactly where you're sitting now, Detective Chen, and he told me that I had not seen what I thought I saw. He said I was exhausted, stressed from my new assignment, that I had experienced a kind of waking nightmare brought on by the trauma of the sisters' disappearance. Sarah leaned forward. But you knew what you saw. Yes, but Bishop Carruthers made it very clear that if I spoke about hooded figures and stone structures and demonic chanting, my career in the church would be over. I would be sent for psychiatric evaluation and quietly removed from ministry. The investigation into the sisters' disappearance would be handled properly, he assured me. Search parties would be organized. The authorities would be cooperative. But I was to say nothing about that clearing. And you agreed. Benedict's voice hardened. I was 43 years old. I had spent my entire adult life in service to the church. I was weak, cowardly. I told myself that the bishop must know best, that my eyes had deceived me in the darkness. He looked directly at Sarah. But I've regretted that decision every day for 37 years. Because those sisters deserved better. They deserved the truth. Marcus moved away from the door. This stone structure. Did you ever go back to look for it? I tried. The next day I went into the forest with 2 police officers. We searched for hours. But I couldn't find that second clearing. It was as if it had never existed. Sarah tapped her pen against her notebook. Father Marsh, I have to ask, do you believe what you saw was real? Or is it possible that the bishop was right? That stress and darkness and fear created something that wasn't there. Benedict was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it on the table between them. It was a ring, tarnished silver with a dark red stone. "This was Sister Clare's," he said. "She wore it always. It had belonged to her grandmother. I found it the next morning, lying on my desk. I have no memory of picking it up, but it was there, real and solid. If what I saw was a hallucination, Detective, how do you explain this?" Sarah reached for the ring, holding it up to the light. The stone was garnet, and etched into the band was an inscription in Latin. "What does it say?" she asked. Benedict's voice was barely a whisper. "Veritas vos liberabit." The truth will set you free. The Forensic Anthropology Lab at the Vermont State Medical Examiner's office smelled of chemicals and cold air. Sarah stood beside Dr. Ellen Reeves, watching as the pathologist examined the skeletal remains laid out on 3 separate examination tables. Each set of bones had been carefully cleaned and arranged in anatomical position, a grim puzzle reconstructed from the earth. "Female. All 3, Dr. Reeves said, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision over the first skeleton. This one was approximately 50 to 55 years old at time of death. Height around 5'6". The bone density suggests good overall health prior to death." She moved to the second table. This one was younger, early to mid-20s, 5'3". Some evidence of childhood malnutrition, healed fractures in the left radius, and ulna, consistent with a fall or defensive injury sustained years before death. Sarah made notes, though the medical examiner would provide a full written report. "And the third?" Dr. Reeves approached the final table, her expression growing more somber. "Mid-40s, 5'7". This one's interesting. See here?" She pointed to the skull, specifically to a series of fine-cut marks on the cranium. "These are perimortem injuries, made at or very near the time of death." Marcus leaned closer. "Weapon? Something thin and sharp. A blade, certainly. But the pattern is unusual, almost ritualistic in nature. Precise, deliberate cuts in a specific pattern." Dr. Reeves traced her finger in the air above the skull, showing the geometry of the wounds without touching them. "And all 3 victims show similar markings, not identical, but related, like a signature." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "You're saying they were murdered?" "Without question. And there's more." Dr. Reeves moved to a light box on the wall and clipped up several X-rays. "Look at the cervical vertebrae in all 3 victims. See these compression fractures? They are consistent with strangulation, manual strangulation, based on the pattern. Someone choked them before making these cuts." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. Sarah stared at the X-rays, at the evidence of violence visited upon 3 women who had dedicated their lives to peace and prayer. "Time of death?" she asked. "Based on decomposition, soil analysis, and the historical context, I'd estimate between 35 and 40 years ago. The soil where they were buried had unusual properties, high alkalinity, low oxygen. It created a kind of natural preservation effect. That's why we have as much tissue remaining as we do." Marcus pulled out his phone and checked something. "October 1987 would put us at 37 years, right in your window." Dr. Reeves nodded. "I'd say that's your timeline. Now, there's one more thing you need to see." She walked to a steel counter and picked up 3 evidence bags. Inside each was a small, dark object. "We found these in the burial site, one placed on each victim's chest, between the ribs." Sarah took one of the bags, holding it up to the light. The object inside was roughly carved from stone, no bigger than a chess piece. It depicted a figure with its arms raised its face featureless except for a gaping mouth. What is it? I have no idea, Dr. Reeves admitted. But it's old, very old. I've sent photos to the archaeology department at the University of Vermont. They might be able to tell us more about its origin and purpose. Sarah examined the other two figurines. They were identical in design, each one carved from the same dark stone, each one positioned the same way. These were placed deliberately, part of whatever ritual killed them. That would be my assessment, Dr. Reeves said. You're not looking at a crime of passion or opportunity, detective. This was planned, ceremonial. And the person who did this knew exactly what they were doing. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression tightened. Sarah, we need to go. That's the station. They've got something on the ground-penetrating radar scan of the convent property. Sarah handed the evidence bag back to Dr. Reeves. What did they find? More burial sites, Marcus said grimly. At least 4 more. The drive back to Millbrook Falls took 20 minutes, but it felt longer. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. 3 nuns, murdered in some kind of ritual, buried behind their convent. And now, evidence of more bodies. The case was expanding in ways she hadn't anticipated, growing darker with each new discovery. You think it was a cult? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. I don't know what to think, Sarah admitted. Father Benedict's story about the hooded figures, the chanting, the stone structure. It sounds like cult activity. But 37 years ago? In rural Vermont? How does something like that go unnoticed? Maybe it didn't, Marcus said. Maybe people noticed and chose not to see. That's what the bishop did, right? He silenced Benedict, made him doubt his own eyes. Sarah thought about this. We need to find out more about the convent's history. Who lived there in 1987? Who had access to the property? What was happening in the months leading up to the disappearances? The diocese will have records. If they haven't been conveniently lost or destroyed. Sarah's tone was bitter. She had dealt with institutional cover-ups before. The way organizations protected themselves at the expense of truth and justice. They pulled into the convent parking lot to find it transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Multiple police vehicles, the medical examiner's van, even a news crew trying to get past the perimeter. Officer Davis, a young woman Sarah had worked with on several cases, waved them through. The radar team is in the back, Davis said. They've marked 4 locations so far. Captain wants you to see them before we start excavating. Sarah and Marcus followed her around the side of the building. The ground-penetrating radar team had set up their equipment in a grid pattern, and bright orange flags marked specific locations across the overgrown garden area. A technician named Robert Klein approached them, tablet in hand. Detectives, what we're seeing is consistent with disturbed earth and organic matter at depths of 4 to 6 feet. Same pattern as the first burial site. The signatures suggest human remains, though we won't know for certain until we excavate. Sarah counted the flags. 4 more potential victims, 7 in total, if all the sites prove to be graves. How long will it take to excavate? She asked. If we work carefully, preserve evidence, probably 2 to 3 days per site. We're talking about a week, maybe more. Marcus was staring at the convent building, his expression troubled. Sarah, think about the logistics. Someone killed these women, performed some kind of ritual, and buried them on consecrated ground. That takes time, privacy, and familiarity with the property. This wasn't a stranger passing through. Sarah followed his gaze to the dark windows of the convent. Whoever did this lived here, or had regular access. They knew the grounds, knew the routines, knew when they could work without being seen. We need to get a list of everyone who was at St. Catherine's in 1987, Marcus said. Already working on it, Officer Davis chimed in. I've been in contact with the diocese. They're pulling personnel records. Should have them by tomorrow morning. Sarah nodded, then turned back to the marked burial sites. 7 women, potentially. 7 lives ended in violence and buried in secret. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear, and it was worse than she had imagined. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Burlington area code she didn't recognize. Detective Chen, she answered. Detective, this is Professor Amanda Woodbridge from UVM's Archaeology Department. Dr. Reeves sent me photos of some artifacts recovered from your crime scene. The stone figurines. Yes. Do you know what they are? There was a pause. I do. And you're not going to like it. Those figurines are consistent with pre-colonial indigenous burial practices, but the specific design is associated with a very particular belief system, one that was violently suppressed by Christian missionaries in the 17th century. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to connect in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. What belief system? The worship of an entity they called the Hollow God, a deity of death, transformation, and sacrifice. The carvings matched descriptions from missionary journals that documented rituals involving live burial and ceremonial strangulation. Detective, whoever placed those figurines knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some amateur occult dabbling. This was someone recreating a very old, very dark practice. Sarah stood in the archives room of the diocesan office in Burlington, surrounded by file boxes that smelled of dust and old paper. Monsignor Patrick Hayes, a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, had shown her and Marcus to this windowless room 2 hours ago and provided them with personnel records dating back to 1985. Everything should be here, he had said, his voice carrying a note of disapproval. Though I must say, Detective, dredging up the past like this seems unnecessarily painful for those who remember. Sarah had smiled politely and assured him they would handle the materials with care. Now, alone with Marcus and several decades of institutional record-keeping, she was beginning to piece together a picture of St. Catherine's Convent in the months before the murders. Listen to this, Marcus said, reading from a folder. In August 1987, 2 months before the disappearances, Bishop Carruthers received a letter from Sister Anne Fitzgerald. She was expressing concerns about unusual activities taking place at the convent, late-night gatherings in the chapel, strange sounds from the basement, and several sisters requesting to be transferred to other parishes. Sarah looked up from the document she was examining. Does it specify what kind of unusual activities? Not in detail. But Sister Anne mentions that she was worried about the spiritual well-being of the community. She references someone she calls the newcomer, but doesn't provide a name. Let me see that. Sarah took the folder and read through Sister Anne's letter carefully. The handwriting was neat, controlled, but there were places where the pen had pressed harder into the paper, where emotion had broken through the careful formality. She's scared. You can feel it in the writing. She's trying to express something serious without being explicit. Marcus pulled out another file. Here. Personnel assignments for 1987. In June, 3 months before the disappearances, a new chaplain was assigned to St. Catherine's, Father Dominic Ashford. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she wrote it down anyway. Where was he transferred from? Marcus flipped through the pages. Doesn't say. Just notes that he was assigned by special request of Bishop Carruthers to provide spiritual guidance and administrative support. That's vague. Very. Marcus kept reading. And here's something interesting. Father Ashford's assignment ended abruptly in November 1987, 1 month after the sisters disappeared. He was transferred to a monastery in New Mexico. No explanation given. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of a lead developing. We need to find him. If he was at the convent during the murders, he might know something. Assuming he's still alive. This was almost 40 years ago. Then we find out if he's alive. Sarah pulled out her phone and called the diocese office. Monsignor Hayes answered on the third ring, his voice tight with barely concealed irritation. Monsignor, this is Detective Chen. I need information on a Father Dominic Ashford. He was assigned to St. Catherine's in 1987. There was a long pause. I'm not familiar with that name, Detective. He was transferred to a monastery in New Mexico in November 1987. I need to know where he is now. Another pause, longer this time. I'll need to research that and get back to you. This is a murder investigation, Monsignor. I need that information today. I understand the urgency, Detective, but our records are extensive and not always easily accessible. I'll do what I can. He hung up before Sarah could press further. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He's stalling. Of course he is. The church has been protecting its own for centuries. They're not going to give us anything that might implicate a priest. Sarah looked down at the files spread across the table. We need to go around them. Find Father Ashford ourselves. She spent the next hour making calls, while Marcus continued reviewing the personnel files. The monastery in New Mexico had no record of a Father Dominic Ashford ever residing there. Neither did the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. It was as if the man had vanished the moment he left St. Catherine's. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, look at this. He handed her a photograph, a formal group portrait, taken in front of the convent in the summer of 1987. 2 rows of nuns, perhaps 20 in total, all in traditional habits. Standing in the back row, slightly apart from the others, was a man in priest's clothing. He was tall, thin, with dark hair and a pale face. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah uncomfortable. A kind of intensity that didn't match the formality of the photograph. That's Father Ashford? She asked. Marcus pointed to the caption written on the back of the photo. Father Dominic Ashford, chaplain, summer 1987. Sarah studied the face. There was something familiar about it, though she couldn't place why. She turned the photograph over and noticed something else written in the corner, in different handwriting, smaller, almost hidden. Pater Mendax. What does that mean? Marcus asked. Sarah pulled out her phone and searched for the translation. When the result appeared, she felt her stomach tighten. Father of lies. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling over them. Someone, presumably one of the nuns, had written that phrase on the photograph. A warning or an accusation. We need to find out everything we can about Dominic Ashford, Sarah said. Where he came from before St. Catherine's, what his background was, why he was really assigned there. Marcus was already on his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm running his name through every database we have access to. Criminal records, seminary registrations, Social Security, everything. While he worked, Sarah returned to the personnel files, looking for any other mention of Father Ashford. She found several memos referencing his work at the convent, all from Bishop Carruthers. They were effusively complimentary, praising Ashford's dedication and spiritual insight. But between the lines, Sarah detected something else, a tone of protectiveness, as if the bishop was building a defensive wall of positive documentation. "Got something," Marcus said suddenly. Dominic Ashford, born 1952, in Providence, Rhode Island, entered seminary in 1971, at the age of 19. Ordained in 1976. He paused, scrolling through the information, and here's where it gets interesting. In 1982, 5 years before his assignment to St. Catherine's, he was removed from a parish in Massachusetts following allegations of inappropriate conduct. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of conduct? Doesn't specify. The records are sealed, but he was sent for psychiatric evaluation and spiritual counseling, spent 2 years at a retreat center in upstate New York before being reassigned to Vermont. And nobody thought to mention this when he was assigned to a convent full of women? Marcus's expression was grim. The church has a long history of moving problematic priests around, instead of removing them from ministry entirely. You know that. Sarah did know that. She had worked cases before, where institutional protection had allowed predators to continue victimizing people for decades. But this felt different, more calculated. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed the Millbrook Falls station. "Chen," she answered. "Detective, it's Officer Davis. We've started excavating the second burial site. You need to get back here. We've found something." "What is it?" Davis's voice was shaken, something Sarah had rarely heard from the normally composed officer. "It's not just human remains, Detective. There's a structure underneath, some kind of chamber. And there are symbols carved into the walls, hundreds of them." The underground chamber was accessed through a narrow opening that the excavation team had carefully widened. Sarah descended a temporary ladder into darkness, her flashlight cutting through the damp air. The smell hit her immediately, a mixture of earth and decay, and something else, something chemical and wrong that made her sinuses burn. Marcus followed her down, and behind him came Dr. Reeves and a crime scene photographer. The space was larger than Sarah had expected, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. The walls were smooth stone, clearly worked by human hands, and carved into every available surface were symbols. Sarah moved her flashlight slowly across the nearest wall. The carvings were intricate, overlapping in places, creating a dense tapestry of images. Some were recognizable, crude figures with arms raised in supplication or agony. Others were abstract, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. And everywhere, repeated over and over, was the same symbol she had seen on the stone figurines, a figure with a gaping mouth and empty eyes. "This is pre-colonial," Dr. Reeves said, her voice hushed. She had brought her own lighting equipment, and now the chamber was illuminated with harsh white LED light that made the carvings stand out in sharp relief. These techniques, the style of carving, this is consistent with indigenous practices from at least 300 years ago, maybe older. The photographer was documenting everything, the flash of his camera creating strobing shadows that made Sarah's head ache. She turned her attention to the floor of the chamber. In the center was a rectangular depression, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The earth inside was darker than the surrounding soil, stained with something that had long since dried and hardened. "Is this where the bodies were?" Marcus asked. "One of them," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "But look here." She pointed to the walls of the depression. More carvings, these ones fresher, the stone less weathered. "These are newer, much newer. Someone has been maintaining this space, adding to it." Sarah knelt beside the depression, careful not to disturb anything. The newer carvings were different in style, less skilled, but more desperate. Words in Latin, phrases she couldn't translate, and dates. She recognized one immediately. October 15th, 1987. The date the three nuns had disappeared. Dr. Reeves moved closer, examining the carved date. This was made after the original chamber was constructed. Someone found this space and repurposed it, used it for their own ritual. Father Ashford, Sarah said quietly. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture that was becoming increasingly disturbing. He knew about this chamber. He must have discovered it when he arrived at the convent. Marcus was examining the opposite wall, where the carvings seemed to tell a story in sequential panels. Sarah, look at this. It's depicting some kind of ceremony. Multiple figures surrounding a central figure lying down. And here, these marks, they look like the same cuts we saw on the victims' skulls. Sarah joined him, following the narrative of the carvings with her flashlight. The story was brutal in its clarity. Preparation, restraint, strangulation, cutting. The ritual removal of something from the victims, though what exactly wasn't clear from the images. And at the end of the sequence, a transformation. The central figure rising, but changed somehow, merged with the gaping-mouthed entity that appeared throughout the chamber. They believed they were transforming the victims, Dr. Reeves said, her academic tone barely masking her horror. This wasn't just murder. It was a sacrificial rite, meant to achieve some kind of spiritual communion with this entity they worshipped. Sarah's radio crackled. Officer Davis's voice came through, distorted by the interference of being underground. Detective Chen, we've found something else. Above ground in the convent building. You need to come up. The climb back to the surface felt longer than the descent. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process what they had discovered. An ancient ritual chamber, reused in modern times, by someone who understood its original purpose. Father Dominic Ashford, a priest with a hidden past and allegations that had been buried. And 7 women, possibly more, who had died in service of some dark belief system that had survived centuries of suppression. Officer Davis met them at the convent's side entrance. Her face was pale, her usual professional composure visibly shaken. We were doing a sweep of the interior, she explained, leading them through a corridor lined with empty rooms. Most of the building is abandoned, gutted, but we found a locked door in the basement. Maintenance had to cut the padlock. They descended a narrow staircase into the convent's basement. The air was stale, heavy with mold and disuse. At the end of a short hallway was a heavy wooden door, now standing open. Inside was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with no windows. The walls were covered in photographs. Sarah stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across hundreds of images pinned and taped to every surface. They were all of the same 3 women, Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, and Sister Claire. Candid shots taken without their knowledge, eating in the dining hall, walking in the garden, praying in the chapel. Some were close-ups, focused on their faces with an intensity that was deeply invasive. He was stalking them, Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. Watching them, documenting their movements. But it was more than that. Sarah moved closer to one section of wall, where the photographs were arranged in a specific pattern. Sister Margaret in the center, surrounded by images that had been defaced, her eyes scratched out in every photo, her mouth covered with red ink. Beneath the arrangement was writing, scrawled directly on the wall, in the same red ink. Silentium est aurum. Mors est liberatio. Transformatio est aeterna. Sarah photographed the writing with her phone and quickly searched for a translation. The results made her stomach turn. Silence is golden. Death is liberation. Transformation is eternal. Marcus was examining another section of wall. Sarah, there are more names here, written on the wall beneath some of the photos. He read them aloud. Sister Anne, Sister Benedict, Sister Catherine, Sister Mary. 4 more names. 4 more potential victims buried on the convent grounds. Sarah backed out of the room, needing air, needing space to think. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was a systematic campaign of violence, planned and executed with religious fervor by someone who had twisted faith into something monstrous. Her phone rang. The Burlington area code again. Detective Chen. The voice was elderly, male, and unfamiliar. My name is Father Thomas Brennan. I was a seminary instructor in the 1970s. Monsignor Hayes contacted me about your inquiry regarding Dominic Ashford. Sarah put the phone on speaker so Marcus could hear. Father Brennan, thank you for calling. What can you tell us about Ashford? There was a long pause, filled with what sounded like difficult breathing. I taught him for 2 years at seminary. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Photographic memory, fluent in 6 languages, including Latin and ancient Greek. But there was something wrong with him, something fundamentally broken. Can you elaborate? He was obsessed with pre-Christian religions, spent all his free time researching indigenous American spiritual practices, European pagan rituals, anything that predated organized Christianity. He wrote his thesis on the suppression of native beliefs by colonial missionaries. Another pause. I recommended that he not be ordained. I told the bishop that Ashford's interests were incompatible with Catholic ministry, but my concerns were dismissed. Sarah felt the case solidifying. Father Brennan, do you know where Ashford is now? No. After he was removed from that parish in Massachusetts, I lost track of him. But Detective, there's something else you should know. During his time at seminary, 3 students went missing. They were never found. The incidents were treated as runaways, young men who couldn't handle the rigors of religious life. But I always wondered. The line went quiet, except for Father Brennan's labored breathing. I should have done more, he said finally. I should have fought harder to keep him out of ministry. But I was young, and I trusted the institutional wisdom of my superiors. That was a mistake I've regretted for 40 years. After the call ended, Sarah stood in the basement hallway, trying to organize the flood of information into something coherent. Dominic Ashford had been groomed by an institution that ignored warning signs, transferred to a convent where he had access to vulnerable women, and had somehow discovered an ancient ritual chamber that he then used to enact his dark fantasies. We need to find him, she said to Marcus. He's the key to all of this. Marcus nodded. I'll put out a nationwide alert. If he's alive, if he's using his real name anywhere, we'll find him. But even as he said it, Sarah knew it wouldn't be that simple. Someone who had evaded consequences for 40 years, who had the protection of powerful institutions, wouldn't be easy to locate. And there was another possibility, one that made her deeply uneasy. What if Ashford had never left? What if he had been here, in the shadows of Millbrook Falls all along? The excavation of the remaining burial sites took 4 days. Each grave revealed the same pattern: female victims, ages ranging from early 20s to mid-50s, all showing signs of manual strangulation, and the same ritualistic cutting on their skulls. All buried with stone figurines placed on their chests. By the end of the week, they had recovered 7 bodies total. Sarah sat in the Millbrook Falls Police Department conference room, surrounded by case files, autopsy reports, and photographs that would haunt her for years. The wall behind her was covered with a timeline she had constructed, mapping out the disappearances, the assignment of Father Ashford, and the institutional responses. Marcus entered with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder. DNA results are back from the state lab. We've got positive identifications on all 7 victims. Sarah took the folder and opened it. The names were listed in chronological order of death, based on Dr. Reeves's analysis. Sister Margaret Hollis, age 52. Disappeared October 15th, 1987. Sister Therese Dumont, age 24. Disappeared October 15th, 1987. Sister Claire Brennan, age 46. Disappeared October 15th, 1987. Sister Anne Fitzgerald, age 38. Disappeared November 3rd, 1987. Sister Benedict Torres, age 31. Disappeared November 18th, 1987. Sister Catherine Ward, age 27. Disappeared December 2nd, 1987. Sister Mary Sullivan, age 41. Disappeared December 15th, 1987. 7 women in 3 months, Sarah said quietly. And nobody connected the disappearances? They were reported, Marcus said, pulling up digital copies of the police reports. But each one was investigated separately. Different jurisdictions, different investigators. And the diocese was actively interfering, claiming the sisters had requested transfers to other convents or had left religious life voluntarily. Sarah felt rage building in her chest. They covered it up. The bishop knew these women were dying, and he covered it up to protect Ashford. Bishop Carruthers died in 1995, Marcus said. Heart attack. But I've been digging into his correspondence from that period. He was in regular contact with someone at the Vatican. Letters marked confidential, discussing sensitive pastoral matters at St. Catherine's. The Vatican knew? I can't prove that definitively. But the pattern suggests institutional knowledge at multiple levels. Local diocese, regional archdiocese, possibly Rome itself. Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. Millbrook Falls was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. But underneath the pleasant facade of white church steeples and autumn leaves, something terrible had been allowed to happen. Her phone rang. Dr. Reeves. Detective Chen. I've completed the full analysis of all 7 victims. There's a pattern you need to know about. Go ahead. The cuts on their skulls, the ritualistic markings, they're not random. When I mapped them out and compared them across all 7 victims, they form a larger pattern, a symbol. Sarah felt a chill. What kind of symbol? I've sent the images to your email. But Detective, whoever did this was creating something, using the victims as pieces of a larger ritual puzzle. And based on the progression, the increasing complexity of the cuts, I believe he was building towards something. A final ceremony that would complete whatever he thought he was accomplishing. Sarah opened her email on her phone. The attachment loaded slowly, and when the image appeared, she had to steady herself against the desk. Dr. Reeves had overlaid the cut patterns from all 7 victims, creating a composite image. The result was unmistakable. The gaping-mouthed figure from the chamber, the hollow god. He was trying to summon it, Sarah said, or invoke it, or become it. Dr. Reeves's voice was grim. That would be my interpretation. And there's one more thing. The pattern isn't complete. Based on the symmetry and the progression, I estimate he would have needed at least 3 more victims to finish whatever ritual he was performing. 3 more women who had been spared, not because Ashford had been stopped, but because he had disappeared before he could complete his work. Marcus was at his computer, typing rapidly. Sarah, I think I found him. Or at least, I found where he went. She moved to look over his shoulder. On the screen was a news article from December 1987, from a small-town newspaper in northern New Hampshire. Local man dies in hiking accident. The article was brief. A man identified as David Ashworth had fallen from a cliff while hiking in the White Mountains. His body had been recovered, and he had been buried in the town cemetery. There was a photograph, grainy and poor quality, but recognizable. It was Father Dominic Ashford. He faked his death, Sarah said. Changed his name slightly, staged an accident, got himself declared dead, and then vanished, Marcus finished. The question is, where did he go? Sarah thought about this, about a man who had spent years researching pre-Christian rituals, who had discovered an ancient chamber and used it to murder 7 women, who had built an elaborate system of documentation and observation. A man that intelligent, that methodical, wouldn't simply disappear without a plan. He's still practicing, she said suddenly. The ritual wasn't complete. He needed 3 more victims. He wouldn't just stop. Marcus's expression darkened. You think he's still killing? I think we need to check for similar cases. Unsolved disappearances of women, particularly those in religious communities. Look for the pattern. Strangulation, ritualistic cutting, burial in significant locations. They spent the next 6 hours searching through national databases, cross-referencing unsolved cases, looking for anything that matched the signature they had identified. And slowly, horribly, a pattern emerged. 1991. Montana. 2 nuns disappeared from a monastery. Never found. 1995. Oregon. 3 women from a retreat center vanished. Never found. 1999. New Mexico. 4 women from a spiritual community went missing. Never found. The gaps were getting longer, but the pattern was consistent. Every 4 to 5 years, multiple women would disappear from religious or spiritual communities, and in each case, there were reports of a chaplain or spiritual advisor who had arrived shortly before the disappearances and left shortly after. He's been doing this for decades, Marcus said, his voice hollow. How many victims are we talking about? Sarah did the math. If we assume the same number each time, maybe 20 to 30 women, maybe more. The conference room door opened, and Captain Rodriguez entered. He was a stocky man in his 50s, normally unflappable, but now his face was tight with stress. I just got off the phone with the district attorney, he said. They want to know if we have enough to issue a warrant for Ashford's arrest. We have physical evidence linking him to 7 murders, Sarah said. We have testimony from Father Brennan about his past. We have the chamber, the photographs, the pattern. Yes, we have enough. Rodriguez nodded. Then make it happen. But Chen, this is going to get ugly. The church is already mobilizing their lawyers. They're claiming we're engaged in religious persecution, that we're using tragic deaths to attack Catholic institutions. Let them claim whatever they want, Sarah said. 7 women are dead. More are missing. We're not stopping until we find him. After Rodriguez left, Sarah returned to the timeline on the wall. She traced the line of dates, the progression of disappearances, the careful planning that had gone into each phase of Ashford's campaign. And she realized something. Marcus, look at the intervals, the time between his killing cycles. Marcus studied the timeline. 4 to 5 years. What about it? They're getting shorter. In the beginning, there were 5 years between incidents, then 4. The last one we found was in 1999, which means if the pattern holds, he should have struck again, around 2003 or 2004. Maybe he died. He'd be in his 70s now. But Sarah didn't think so. Men like Ashford didn't simply stop. They evolved, adapted, found new ways to satisfy their compulsions. And there was one possibility that made her blood run cold. "What if he did return?" she said quietly. "What if he's been here, in Millbrook Falls, all along, waiting for the right moment to complete what he started?" The knock on Sarah's apartment door came at 11:30 p.m. She had been sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by case files and her laptop, trying to find any trace of Dominic Ashford after his supposed death in 1987. She wasn't expecting visitors, and the lateness of the hour made her hand instinctively move toward her service weapon. Through the peephole, she saw Father Benedict Marsh, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale and strained in the harsh hallway light. Sarah opened the door. "Father Marsh, what are you doing here? It's late." "I know. I apologize for the intrusion." His voice was unsteady. "But I couldn't sleep. Haven't slept properly in days. Not since they found the bodies. And there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said 37 years ago." Sarah stepped aside to let him enter. He moved slowly into her small living room, refusing her offer to sit, instead standing near the window that overlooked the quiet street. "I lied to you," he said without preamble. "When I told you about that night in the forest, about the hooded figures and the chanting, I didn't tell you everything." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What did you leave out?" Benedict turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see tears on his weathered cheeks. "I recognized one of them. One of the hooded figures. I saw his face when he turned toward me, just for a moment before I ran. It was Father Ashford." The confession hung in the air between them. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, professional. "You saw Ashford participating in the ritual that night? The night the sisters disappeared?" "Yes. And I told Bishop Carruthers. I told him everything, including Ashford's involvement. Do you know what he said?" Benedict's hands were shaking on his cane. "He said that was impossible. That Father Ashford had been in Burlington that evening, attending a diocesan meeting. The bishop showed me a sign-in sheet with Ashford's signature, time-stamped at 6 p.m., the exact time I claimed to have seen him in the forest. The bishop gave Ashford an alibi. More than that, he made me believe I was wrong. He showed me photographs from the meeting, though Ashford wasn't visible in any of them. He explained how stress and fear could cause the mind to create false memories, to see familiar faces in unfamiliar situations. And I was so desperate to believe him, to believe that I hadn't seen what I had seen, that I convinced myself he was right." Sarah crossed to her kitchen table and pulled out the photograph of Ashford from the case file. "Father Marsh, I need you to look at this photograph very carefully. Is this the man you saw in the forest that night?" Benedict took the photograph with trembling hands. He stared at it for a long moment, and when he looked up, his expression was one of absolute certainty. "Yes, that's him. I've seen that face in my nightmares for 37 years. It's definitely him." Sarah took back the photograph and made a note in her file. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not when we first interviewed you?" "Because I'm 80 years old, Detective. I've spent most of my life in service to an institution that I believed represented truth and justice and moral authority. But that institution protected a monster. It silenced me, manipulated me, and allowed 7 women to die. I can't take that to my grave." He wiped his eyes roughly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I can at least tell the truth now, even if it's decades too late." Sarah felt a wave of compassion for the old priest, but it was tempered by anger at the system that had enabled such profound injustice. "Father Marsh, there's something else I need to know. In the months after the disappearances, did you notice anything unusual about the convent? Any changes to the building, Any construction work? Benedict frowned, thinking. Actually, yes. In January of 1988, about 2 months after the last sister disappeared, there were workers at the convent for several weeks. They said they were doing foundation repairs, something about water damage in the basement. Bishop Carruthers arranged it all directly. I remember thinking it was odd that he was so personally involved in what seemed like a routine maintenance issue. Do you remember which company did the work? No, but they weren't local. The workers came from out of state, I think. They kept to themselves, didn't interact with anyone at the parish. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. They were sealing the chamber. Ashford had already left, staged his death. The bishop brought in outside contractors to cover the entrance to the ritual chamber, to make sure it would never be found. Benedict's face crumpled. Dear God, the cover-up went that deep? It appears so. And Father Marsh, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. In the years since the disappearances, have you ever seen anyone who looked like Ashford? Anyone who reminded you of him, even if they were older or had changed their appearance? The old priest was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then something shifted in his expression. There's a man. He arrived in Millbrook Falls about 10 years ago. Bought the old Morrison estate on the outskirts of town. He's a recluse mostly. People say he's some kind of scholar, works from home. I've only seen him a few times, at a distance, but there was something about him that always made me uneasy. What's his name? David Ashworth. Sarah felt ice in her veins. The same name Ashford had used when he faked his death in New Hampshire. Are you certain about the name? Yes. I remember because when I first heard it, something about it felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. It was only later that I remembered the obituary I'd seen years before, for the man who died in the hiking accident. But I told myself it was just a coincidence, that I was seeing patterns where none existed. Sarah was already moving toward her phone. Father Marsh, I need you to stay here. Don't leave, don't call anyone. I'm going to contact my partner. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. Sarah, it's almost midnight. He's here, Marcus. Ashford is here in Millbrook Falls. He's been here for 10 years, living under the same alias he used to fake his death. The Morrison estate, do you know it? She heard rustling on the other end, the sound of Marcus getting out of bed. The old place on Hollow Road? I know it. Sarah, if you're right, we need backup. We need a warrant. We need to move now. If he realizes we're onto him, he'll disappear again. How many more women will die while we're waiting for paperwork? Marcus was silent for a moment. I'm on my way to your place. Don't do anything until I get there. While she waited for Marcus, Sarah researched David Ashworth. The public records were sparse. He owned the Morrison estate outright, paid his taxes on time, had no criminal record under that name. But there were no photographs, no social media presence, nothing that would allow her to confirm his actual identity. Father Benedict sat in her living room, his hands clasped in prayer, his lips moving silently. Sarah watched him and thought about the weight of secrets, the damage caused by institutional protection of predators, the lives destroyed by silence. Marcus arrived 15 minutes later, followed by Officer Davis and 2 other uniformed officers. They gathered in Sarah's small living room, and she briefed them on what Father Benedict had told her. We don't have a warrant, Marcus said. If we go to the Morrison estate without one, anything we find could be inadmissible. Then we do a welfare check, Sarah said. We have credible information that a person of interest in multiple homicides may be at that location. We have reasonable cause to approach the property and make contact. Marcus nodded slowly. And if he refuses to speak with us? Then we get our warrant and come back. But Marcus, if this is really Ashford, if he's been here for 10 years planning something, we can't wait. The pattern suggests he's due for another killing cycle. We might already be too late. They left Father Benedict at Sarah's apartment, with strict instructions not to leave or contact anyone. The drive to Hollow Road took 20 minutes through dark, winding country roads. The Morrison estate sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a Victorian mansion that had been built in the 1890s and slowly decayed over the subsequent century. Now, in the darkness, it was a silhouette against the cloudy night sky, one light visible in an upstairs window. Sarah killed the headlights as they approached, parking her sedan 100 yards from the house. Marcus pulled up behind her, and they gathered in the road to discuss their approach. "Davis, you and Jenkins cover the back of the house," Sarah instructed. "Marcus and I will approach the front. If anyone tries to leave, you stop them." "Understood?" The officers moved into position, their flashlights off, navigating by moonlight. Sarah and Marcus approached the front porch, their hands on their weapons, but not drawn. The house was silent, except for the wind moving through nearby trees. Sarah knocked on the door. No response. She knocked again, louder. "Mr. Ashworth, this is the Millbrook Falls Police Department. We need to speak with you." Silence. Marcus tried the doorknob. Locked. He looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he radioed Davis to check the back entrance. "Back door is open," Davis reported after a moment. "Looks like it was forced. Recently." Sarah drew her weapon. "We're going in. Possible break-in in progress." They entered through the front door, which Marcus managed to open with a credit card, the old lock offering minimal resistance. The interior of the house was dark, lit only by the glow from upstairs. The air smelled of old wood and something else, something chemical, that made Sarah's eyes water. They moved through the downstairs rooms quickly. A living room filled with books, many of them old leather-bound volumes in Latin and Greek. A kitchen that looked rarely used. A study with a desk covered in papers and photographs. Sarah paused at the desk, using her flashlight to examine the papers. They were maps, dozens of them, showing locations across the United States. Each map had locations marked with red ink, and beside each mark was a date and a number. Montana, 1991, 2. Oregon, 1995, 3. New Mexico, 1999, 4. The pattern she and Marcus had identified, documented, and cataloged by the killer himself. "Sarah," Marcus called from the hallway. "Upstairs." She followed him up the creaking staircase. The light was coming from a room at the end of the hall, and as they approached, Sarah could hear a sound, low, rhythmic chanting in a language she didn't recognize. Marcus reached the door first and pushed it open, his weapon raised. The room beyond was a chapel of sorts, though no Christian deity was worshipped here. The walls were covered in the same symbols they had found in the underground chamber. Candles burned on every surface, casting dancing shadows. And in the center of the room, kneeling before a stone altar, was a figure in a black robe. "Police! Don't move!" Marcus shouted. The figure turned slowly. As the hood fell back, Sarah saw the face of an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, with white hair and pale skin. His eyes were dark and utterly devoid of emotion. Dominic Ashford smiled at them. "Detectives," he said calmly, "I've been expecting you, though I had hoped to finish my work before you arrived." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him. "Father Dominic Ashford, you're under arrest for the murders of 7 women. Put your hands behind your head and kneel on the ground." Ashford didn't move. "7," he said thoughtfully. Such an incomplete number. 3 short of perfection. 3 short of transformation. Do you have any idea how frustrating it's been, living with that incompleteness for 37 years? On the ground now, Sarah commanded. Instead, Ashford stood, and Sarah saw what was behind the altar. 3 photographs, arranged in a triangle. She recognized 2 of them immediately. Officer Davis and Sister Anne's great-niece, who worked at the town library. The third was a face she saw every morning in the mirror, her own photograph. You were meant to complete the pattern, Ashford said, still smiling. The investigator consumed by her own investigation. The seeker who finds more than she bargained for. It would have been poetic. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger, but Sarah held up her hand. She needed Ashford talking, needed him to confess to everything. The recording device in her pocket was capturing every word. How did you choose them? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. The sisters. How did you decide which ones would die? Ashford's expression became almost dreamy. They chose themselves in a way. The ones who asked too many questions, the ones who noticed things they shouldn't have noticed. Sister Anne found the entrance to the chamber during a cleaning day. She didn't understand what she was looking at, but she knew it was wrong. She wrote to the bishop about it. So you killed her to keep her quiet. I liberated her, Ashford corrected. I freed her from the prison of her limited understanding. Each sister I transformed became part of something greater than themselves. They merged with the hollow God, became vessels for ancient power that predates your petty Christian mythology by thousands of years. Sarah forced herself not to react to his delusions. The bishop knew what you were doing. He protected you. Bishop Carruthers was a practical man. He understood that sometimes institutions must make difficult choices to preserve themselves. When I showed him what I had discovered in that chamber, when I explained the significance of the site, he recognized that revelation of such a place would destroy the Church's authority in this region. Better to quietly relocate a few sisters than admit that Catholic holy ground had been built atop a pagan temple of human sacrifice. He gave you permission to kill them? Ashford laughed, a dry sound like leaves rustling. Permission? No. But he gave me protection, which amounts to the same thing. He provided me with alibis, transferred me when the timing was right, even arranged for my death to be faked when it became clear the investigation might intensify. The Church has centuries of experience in managing inconvenient truths, Detective. Marcus's radio crackled. Davis's voice, urgent. Detectives, we have a situation. There's someone else in the house. Basement. Female. Appears to be restrained. Sarah's heart hammered. Is she alive? Yes, but barely. We need medical now. Sarah kept her weapon on Ashford, while Marcus radioed for an ambulance. The old man's smile never wavered. You found her, he said with satisfaction. I was saving her for tonight, the first of the final 3. But you've interrupted the ceremony, which is disappointing. Who is she? Does it matter? She's nobody. A drifter I found 3 weeks ago, living in her car behind the grocery store. No family, no one who would miss her. The perfect sacrifice. He tilted his head, much like you would have been, Detective Chen. Dedicated to your work, to the exclusion of all else, isolated, alone. Nobody who would truly mourn your absence. The words stung because they contained truth. Sarah had devoted herself so completely to her career that her personal life had withered. Her last relationship had ended 2 years ago. She saw her parents maybe twice a year. Her friendships were mostly professional. Ashford had profiled her perfectly. Get on the ground, she said again, her voice harder now. Ashford sighed and began to comply. lowering himself carefully to his knees, but as he did, his hand moved toward something at his belt. Sarah saw the glint of metal and fired instinctively, aiming for his shoulder. The shot echoed in the confined space, deafeningly loud. Ashford fell backward, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his black robe. But he was still smiling, even as Marcus moved in to secure him. "Too late," Ashford gasped. "The pattern is already complete. Not in body, but in spirit. 7 vessels opened, 7 doorways created. The hollow God doesn't need flesh to enter this world. It needs belief, fear, and blood. And you've given it all 3. Sarah felt cold wash over her. "What did you do?" "The excavation," Ashford wheezed. "When you opened the chamber, when you exposed it to air and light, after centuries of darkness, you completed the ritual. The 7th seal, broken by the hands of the innocent investigator. It's perfect. Better than I could have planned." Marcus had the handcuffs on Ashford now, but the old man was laughing, blood bubbling at his lips. "You think arresting me matters? You think justice can undo what's been done? The hollow God is awake, detective, and it's hungry." Paramedics arrived, rushing up the stairs with a stretcher. They worked quickly on Ashford's shoulder wound, while Officer Davis appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "The woman in the basement," she reported. "She's been drugged, but she's stable. Paramedics are with her now. And Sarah. There's something else down there you need to see." Sarah followed Davis down to the basement, while Marcus accompanied Ashford to the ambulance. The space was larger than the main floor, clearly excavated and expanded at some point. The walls were rough stone, and carved into them were the same symbols from the chamber at St. Catherine's. But it was what hung on the far wall that made Sarah's blood freeze. 7 photographs, not the sisters, 7 different women, all recent. Some she recognized from missing person reports, filed in the surrounding counties over the past year. Women who had vanished without a trace, their disappearances attributed to voluntary departure or foul play by unknown persons. Ashford had been active, not every 4 or 5 years, as the pattern suggested, continuously, for decades. "How many?" Davis whispered. Sarah counted the photographs, then counted again, hoping she was wrong. 23 on this wall alone. They found more in a filing cabinet. Dozens of folders, each containing photographs, personal information, and handwritten notes detailing Ashford's surveillance of potential victims. The scope of it was staggering. He had been hunting, selecting, taking women for nearly 40 years, leaving behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions across the entire country. Sarah's phone rang. "Marcus, Ashford's asking for you. He says he'll only give a full confession if you're present during transport to the hospital." She climbed back upstairs and out to the ambulance, where Ashford lay strapped to a gurney, his shoulder bandaged, an IV in his arm. The paramedics stepped back to give them privacy, though they remained close enough to intervene if needed. "Detective Chen," Ashford said, his voice weaker now, but still carrying that unsettling calm. "You want answers. I'll give them to you. But first, you need to understand something." "I don't need to understand anything except where the bodies are buried." "The bodies are everywhere. Montana, Oregon, New Mexico, a dozen other states. I left maps in my study. Coordinates for every burial site. You'll find them all." He coughed, wincing. "But that's not what matters. What matters is why." Despite herself, Sarah leaned closer. "Then tell me why. Make me understand why you destroyed so many lives." Ashford's eyes focused on her with unsettling intensity. "Because the hollow God promised me immortality, not of the body, but of the spirit. Each woman I transformed became a part of me, their lives absorbed into mine. I carry them all inside me, Detective. 23 souls, 23 lifetimes of experience and memory. I am more than human now. I am eternal. Sarah felt sick. You're a delusional murderer who convinced yourself that killing made you special. Am I? Ashford smiled. Then explain this. I'm 72 years old, Detective. I should be decrepit, dying. But I have the strength of a man half my age. I haven't been sick in 40 years. Not even a cold. The ritual works. The hollow God keeps its promises to those who serve it faithfully. Coincidence and good genes. Believe what you need to believe. But when you're lying awake at night, thinking about this case, you'll wonder. And that wondering will be its own kind of service to the hollow God. Doubt, fear, the erosion of certainty. That's how it feeds. The paramedics moved back in, preparing to transport him. Sarah stepped away, watching as the ambulance pulled out of the driveway, lights flashing. Marcus joined her, his face grim. That woman in the basement, her name is Jennifer Cole. She's been missing for 3 weeks from Springfield, 2 counties over. Her family's been searching for her. At least we can give them closure, Sarah said quietly. At least we saved one. They spent the rest of the night processing the scene. The maps, the photographs, the detailed records Ashford had kept of his decades-long campaign of murder. Each discovery was another piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of systematic, calculated evil, enabled by institutional complicity and protected by silence. As dawn broke over Millbrook Falls, Sarah stood in the yard of the Morrison estate, watching crime scene techs carry box after box of evidence to their van. Father Benedict had been right. Secrets never stayed buried forever. But the cost of their revelation was measured in lives destroyed, families shattered, and the terrible knowledge that monsters could hide behind collars and crosses for decades, while those in power looked away. Her phone rang. Captain Rodriguez. Chen. The district attorney wants a briefing at 9 a.m. The church is already releasing statements, claiming they had no knowledge of Ashford's activities and are fully cooperating with the investigation. Sarah felt anger rise in her throat. That's a lie. We have documentation proving Bishop Carruthers knew what was happening. I know. And we'll present all of it. But Sarah, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get political. The church has resources and lawyers. They're going to fight this. Let them fight, Sarah said. We have the evidence. We have Ashford's confession. And we have 23 families who deserve justice. After she hung up, Marcus approached with 2 cups of coffee from the station. They stood together in silence, watching the sun rise over a town that would never be quite the same. You think he was telling the truth? Marcus asked finally. About the ritual. About opening the chamber, completing some kind of pattern. Sarah thought about this. I think he believed it was true. And I think that belief drove him to kill for 40 years. Whether the hollow God is real or just a delusion doesn't change what he did. But you wonder. She did wonder. Late at night, when the case files were closed and she was alone with her thoughts, she would remember the certainty in Ashford's eyes, the symbols carved into ancient stone, the systematic precision of his killings. And she would wonder if there were forces in the world that existed beyond rational explanation, waiting in the darkness for believers to give them form and purpose. But that was a thought for another day. Right now, there was work to do. Bodies to recover. Families to notify. Justice to pursue through every legal channel available, no matter how powerful the institutions that opposed them. Sarah drained her coffee and turned toward her car. Come on, we have a briefing to prepare for. As they drove back toward town, she caught a glimpse of St. Catherine's Convent in her rearview mirror, its empty windows catching the morning light. The building had stood for over a century, a monument to faith and service. Now it would be remembered for something else entirely. The place where 3 nuns vanished, and where the truth, buried for 37 years, finally clawed its way back into the light. 6 months later, Sarah Chen sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse in Burlington, watching as the verdict was read. The trial had lasted 8 weeks, a media spectacle that had drawn national attention and forced uncomfortable conversations about institutional accountability and the protection of predators. Dominic Ashford, now 73 years old and confined to a wheelchair after complications from his gunshot wound, showed no emotion as the judge pronounced him guilty on 23 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and anguish. Families who had waited decades for answers wept openly. Journalists scrambled to file their stories, and Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: emptiness. She had thought that justice would bring closure, that seeing Ashford convicted would provide some sense of completion. But instead, she felt only the weight of all those years of suffering, all those lives ended too soon, all those families torn apart by a man who had been protected by an institution that valued its reputation over human lives. The church had fought viciously throughout the trial. Their lawyers had argued that Bishop Carruthers's correspondence had been taken out of context, that there was no evidence of deliberate complicity, that the diocese had been as victimized by Ashford's deception as everyone else. But the jury hadn't believed them. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern of protection too clear. In a separate civil proceeding, the diocese had been found liable for negligence and obstruction of justice. The financial settlements would bankrupt several parishes. St. Catherine's Convent had been seized as evidence and would eventually be demolished. The land returned to the state. Marcus touched her arm gently. "You okay?" Sarah nodded. "Just thinking about all the time that was lost. All the women who could have been saved if someone had acted sooner." "You can't think like that. You'll drive yourself crazy." She knew he was right, but it was hard not to replay the timeline in her mind, not to imagine what might have been different if Father Benedict had been believed in 1987, if the seminary instructor had fought harder to keep Ashford out of ministry, if any of the dozens of people who had seen warning signs had chosen to act rather than defer to institutional authority. After the sentencing hearing concluded, Ashford was given life without possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively. He would die in prison, though given his age and failing health, that day would likely come sooner rather than later. As the bailiffs wheeled him out of the courtroom, he turned his head and caught Sarah's eye. He smiled. That same calm, unsettling smile she had seen in the chapel at the Morrison estate. And then he was gone, disappearing through the doorway into the halls of the Federal Detention Center, where he would spend whatever remained of his life. Sarah stood and made her way through the crowd to the courthouse steps where reporters had gathered. Captain Rodriguez was already there, making a statement on behalf of the department. Sarah waited until he finished, then stepped up to the microphone cluster. "I want to thank the families of the victims for their patience and courage throughout this process," she said, her voice steady. "This has been an incredibly difficult journey for all of them, and their strength has been an inspiration to everyone involved in this investigation." A reporter from the Boston Globe called out a question. "Detective Chen, do you believe there could be more victims that haven't been discovered yet?" "Based on the evidence we've collected, we believe we've identified all of Father Ashford's victims. However, the investigation remains open, and we encourage anyone with information about potential additional cases to contact the FBI's tip line." What about the church's role in protecting Ashford? Will there be criminal charges against current diocesan officials? Sarah chose her words carefully. The district attorney's office is reviewing all evidence related to institutional knowledge and complicity. I can't comment on potential future charges. The questions continued for another 10 minutes before Captain Rodriguez stepped in and ended the press conference. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah noticed an elderly man standing at the edge of the courthouse plaza, watching her. Father Benedict Marsh. She walked over to him, and they stood together in awkward silence for a moment. "I wanted to thank you," Benedict said finally, "for believing me, for pursuing the truth, even when powerful forces tried to bury it. You did the right thing coming forward. Those families have answers now because of you." Benedict shook his head slowly. "I should have done it 37 years ago. I should have fought harder, been braver. Sister Margaret, Sister Therese, Sister Claire, all the others, they deserved better than my cowardice. You were manipulated by people not in positions of authority, people you trusted. That doesn't absolve me of responsibility." He looked up at the courthouse, its classical architecture gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I've left the priesthood, you know. After the trial started, after the full scope of the church's complicity became clear, I couldn't continue to serve an institution that had betrayed its fundamental mission so completely." Sarah was surprised. "What will you do?" "I'm not certain yet. Perhaps work with an organization that helps survivors of institutional abuse. Try to make some kind of amends, however inadequate." He paused. "Detective, may I ask you something? That night at the Morrison estate, when you found Ashford in his chapel, did you sense anything? Anything unusual or unexplainable?" Sarah thought about this carefully. She remembered the oppressive atmosphere in that room, the way the candlelight had seemed to move in patterns that defied the physics of flame and air. She remembered the sudden cold that had washed over her when Ashford spoke about the hollow god, and the nightmares she'd had in the weeks that followed. Dreams of empty mouths and ancient stones, and voices chanting in languages that predated human speech. But she also knew the power of suggestion, the way the human mind could create meaning from random stimuli when primed by fear and expectation. "I think Ashford believed in what he was doing," she said finally. "And belief can be a powerful thing, even when it's based on delusion." Benedict nodded slowly. "Yes, belief can move mountains, as the scripture says, but it can also justify monstrous acts." He extended his hand. "Thank you again, Detective, for everything." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the papery skin and fragile bones of a man who had carried the weight of secrets for most of his life. Then she watched him walk away, his cane tapping on the courthouse steps, disappearing into the afternoon crowd. Marcus appeared beside her. "Ready to go?" "The captain's buying drinks for the team." "Yeah, just give me a minute." She walked to the edge of the plaza, where a small memorial had been erected. 23 names carved into black granite, each representing a life stolen by Dominic Ashford's twisted vision of transformation and immortality. Sarah traced her fingers over Sister Margaret's name, then Sister Therese's, then Sister Claire's. 3 nuns who had vanished on an autumn evening in 1987, walking into the forest for their evening prayers and never returning. 3 women who had been part of a community dedicated to service and compassion, whose deaths had been covered up and forgotten by the very institution they had devoted their lives to serving. But they hadn't been forgotten. Not really. Their absence had echoed through the years, a wound that refused to heal, a question that demanded answering. And in the end, the truth had emerged, dragged into the light by the stubborn persistence of people who refused to accept easy lies. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jennifer Cole, the woman they had rescued from Ashford's basement. She had been sending occasional updates on her recovery, thanking Sarah for saving her life. "Finished my first week back at work today," the message read. "Still having nightmares, but my therapist says that's normal. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for caring about one more missing woman when it would have been easier to look away." Sarah typed a reply, then put her phone away and turned toward where Marcus was waiting. The work was never really done. There were always more cases, more victims, more families searching for answers. But today, at least, there had been justice, imperfect, incomplete, arriving decades too late, but justice nonetheless. As she walked across the plaza, Sarah felt the autumn wind picking up, carrying with it the smell of fallen leaves and coming rain. Somewhere in Vermont, in a wooded clearing that had once been the site of unspeakable violence, 3 rosaries still lay on a flat stone, left behind by women who had believed in the power of prayer to protect them. It hadn't been enough. Faith alone had never been enough to shield the innocent from those who wore righteousness as a disguise for evil. But truth, stubbornly pursued and fearlessly spoken, could still tear down walls of silence, could still bring monsters into the light where they could be seen for what they truly were, could still provide answers to families who had spent decades wondering, hoping, grieving. Sarah joined Marcus, and they walked together toward his car, leaving behind the courthouse and the memorial and the weight of a case that had consumed 6 months of her life. Tomorrow there would be other investigations, other victims, other searches for truth in a world that seemed determined to bury it. But tonight, she would allow herself to believe that the work mattered, that justice, however delayed, was still worth fighting for, that the 23 names carved into that granite memorial would be remembered not just as victims, but as people whose lives had meaning, whose deaths had demanded accountability, and whose stories had finally been told. The sun was setting over Burlington as they drove back toward Millbrook Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah watched the landscape pass by and thought about Father Benedict's question. Had she sensed anything unusual in Ashford's chapel? Anything that couldn't be explained by psychology and atmospheric manipulation? She thought about the symbols carved into stone, repeated across centuries by people who believed in powers beyond human understanding. She thought about Ashford's absolute certainty, his claims of transformation and immortality. She thought about the 23 women whose lives had ended in service to a delusion. Or perhaps not a delusion. Perhaps something older and darker than she wanted to acknowledge. But that was a thought she would keep to herself, locked away in the part of her mind that dealt with things that had no place in police reports or courtroom testimony. Some questions she had learned were better left unanswered. As they drove through the growing darkness, Sarah allowed her eyes to close, and in the space between waking and sleep, she could have sworn she heard something. A distant chanting, in a language she didn't recognize, carried on the wind through empty forests and forgotten clearings where ancient stones still stood, waiting for the next believer to find them and begin the cycle again. She opened her eyes, and the sound was gone. Marcus glanced over at her. "You sure you're okay?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, just tired. Get some rest. You've earned it." She would try. But she knew that tonight, like every night since they had found the chamber at St. Catherine's, her dreams would be haunted by empty mouths and gaping eyes and the terrible certainty that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. The 3 nuns who had vanished in 1987 had their justice now. Their names were known, their deaths acknowledged, their killer convicted. But the hollow God, whether real or imagined, whether ancient entity or human creation, still waited in the darkness, still whispered to those who would listen, still promised transformation to those desperate or deluded enough to believe. And somewhere, Sarah knew with cold certainty, someone was listening,